Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of our course on the shape of Messianic Jewish theology. This week, our topic is Yeshua. And I have to say, it seems like we're barely skimming the surface of all of these topics, given the limited amount that we have, the limited amount of time we have to deal with all of them. But for me, this is probably the most intimidating to try to deal with in 1 week and in an hour lecture. So we're going to, again, just end up skimming the surface of it, but I want to at least talk about, as much as we can, the way that Yeshua both fits into and shapes Messianic Jewish theology. So we again have as you listen to the lecture. And I want to begin by reminding us of this quote from Mark Kinzer that we looked at earlier in the term, where he talks about the relationship between Judaism and Messiah in Messianic Judaism. So he says, Messianic Judaism involves more than a subtle tweaking of an existing form of Jewish life and thought, adding a few elements required by faith in Yeshua and subtracting a few elements incompatible with that faith. Instead, the Judaism we have inherited and continue to practice is entirely bathed in the bright light of Yeshua's revelation. In a circular and dynamic interaction, our Judaism provides us with the framework required to interpret Yeshua's revelation, even as it is reconfigured by that revelation. In this way, our Judaism and our Yeshua faith are organically and holistically integrated. So again, this is the point that I'm making, is that Yeshua really informs every aspect of Messianic Jewish theology in the same way that our understanding of Yeshua is informed by our Judaism and the Jewish framework that we come from. So that being said, the approach that I want to take as we look at Yeshua today is to look at every aspect or every doctrine that we're looking at in this course and look at Yeshua in relation to that. So we've already talked about God, Israel, and Torah, so I want to talk about Yeshua and slash as God, Yeshua and slash as Torah, and Yeshua and slash as Israel. And then also, of course, extremely relevant is Yeshua and the Spirit, which we haven't talked specifically about the Spirit yet. We'll do that next week. And so we'll leave those reflections for next week. And Yeshua and the land, which is our last sort of substantive week of the course before we spend the final week wrapping up. So today we're going to try to tackle the first three, Yeshua and God, Israel, and Torah. In the coming weeks, we will also talk about Yeshua in connection to the Spirit and Yeshua in connection to the land. So that's where we're going today and where we'll go in the coming weeks of the course. So as we talk about Yeshua and slash as God, huge topic, lots of ink in the history of the Christian church spilled on this topic. I want to point our attention to Colossians 1:15 through 20. There's a lot of passages that we could go to, but this is one of the ones that I think is so descriptive when it comes to the relationship between Yeshua and God. Colossians says he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created. There's that creation language, which is, of course, God of Israel language, God creator language. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the ecclesia. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So there's a lot that we could say about this passage. Again, we have that creation language, Yeshua's presence at and role in creation. The fact that he is the head of the ecclesia, which we'll increasingly see is a visible union and reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles. We've already talked about this a bit in our forum discussions, but that is, I would argue, a touchstone, a necessary component of what the ecclesia, the body of Yeshua followers, is it's a visible reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles. And then you get this kind of future reference. He's the firstborn among the dead, the idea that he is the first fruits of the resurrection, pointing toward the eschatological destiny that all of us have in light of Yeshua being raised from the dead. This beautiful phrase that God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and then again this language of reconciliation, which there's all kinds of ways in which Yeshua works about the reconciliation that God is bringing into his creation. The one that I would highlight again is the reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles. Israel's enemies in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, are always the nations, right? The tensions in the Tanakh are caused because of the relationship between Israel and the nations. And this is the hostility that Yeshua comes to reconcile by bringing harmony and unity to this troubled relationship between Israel and the nations. So again, Israel embodying God's plan and purpose and presence in the world. These are the kinds of things the Nicene Creed, I think, does a good job getting at. So again, we've talked about the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea already in this class, convened in 325 AD by the Emperor Constantine. There was no Jewish representation at the Council of Nicaea, so it's an entirely Gentile council, which of course has many problems in and of itself. But what I would say is that most of, if not all of the problems with the Nicene Creed are not with what was included, but with what wasn't included. And of course, that's part of the problem with having no Jewish representation there, is that, for example, God is referred to as the creator of heaven and earth, but never is he directly referred to as the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who freed his people from slavery in Egypt. These are ways that God refers to himself throughout the Tanakh and the New Testament as well. But of course, the Nicene Creed doesn't mention any of them. But what it does mention, this sort of very high Christology, as we call it, is accurate. So this sort of second big paragraph of the Nicene Creed: we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, Yeshua Messiah, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. For us and for our salvation he came down from heaven. By the power of the Holy Spirit he came incarnate from the Virgin Mary and was made man. So we see that Colossians reference here: through him all things were made. And also all of this language about God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, is expanding on Yeshua's divinity, on Yeshua's equality and oneness with God the Father. And so when I'm teaching this to my undergraduates, and I'm trying to explain the idea of Yeshua being begotten, not made, I use the analogy of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo was an amazing artist and sculptor, and if you think about the sculpture of David, art historians have remarked about the statue of David and how remarkably accurate it is to the human figure. The way that the muscles are shaped, and the way that you can see the statue's tendons, and everything about it is this unbelievable representation of a human body. And of course, Michelangelo dissected cadavers in order to perfectly understand how all of the parts of the body fit together so that he could perfectly represent it in his art. But nobody would say that the statue of David is a human being. So the distinction between something being made and something being begotten is that whether or not it's of the same stuff as the creator of it, or the one who begets it. So if Michelangelo had a son, you think about the difference between Michelangelo's son and Michelangelo's statue of the David. The David is a perfect, remarkable representation of a human being, but he's not a human being in the same way that Michelangelo's son is kind of bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. So that's the distinction that the Nicene Creed is trying to get at when it uses this phrase begotten, not made, which is of course talking about the oneness of Yeshua and the Creator God, who is of course the God of Israel. Dallas Willard, in what we read last week, talks about the problem of docetism, which is an early Christian heresy that comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means to appear or to seem. And docetism is the idea that Yeshua only seemed to have a human body, but he wasn't fully human. And so, of course, the tension with describing Yeshua is that he was, of course, fully God and fully man, a mystery that we can never fully describe, but it's part of the greatness and the grandeur of who Yeshua is. So as Willard says, docetism is the ancient heresy that Christ did not, in fact, have a real body. body at all, but only seems to have one. This thinking remains alive and well today in the hearts and minds of many who say he was human as well as divine, but in fact do not believe and cannot even imagine that he had a full-fledged human body. They cannot do so because we tend to think of the body and its functions as only a hindrance to our spiritual calling, with no positive role in our redemption or in our participation in the government of God. And so, of course, Willard is pointing out one problematic extreme, which is essentially denying Yeshua's full humanity. On the other end, we're all too familiar with the extreme of denying Yeshua's full divinity, which certainly in the history of Judaism and in certain segments of the Messianic Jewish movement is even more common. And so this is the tension with our confession of Yeshua, is that he was indeed fully God and fully man. And of course, again, church history has had lots to say about that. But somehow we have to hold on to those. And we talked earlier in the term about the tensions that lie at the heart of Messianic Jewish theology and also at the heart of Christian theology. And this is perhaps the central tension is the full humanity and the full divinity of Yeshua. But of course, when we talk about Yeshua as God, we have to come back to this question raised by N.T. Wright, which is, which God are we talking about? And so I'm have duplicated a slide from the previous lecture where N.T. Wright and many of you chose to listen to his lecture on Jesus and God, where he really unpacks these ideas. The fact that there are several different options, not so many options, but several different options of what God we're talking about when we reference God. One is the sort of deist God who creates the world and then stands far off from it. Another is the pantheist God who is essentially one with the world and lacks adequate distinction from his creation. And N.T. Wright wants to reflect on the God of Israel, the creator God, as the God of creation and covenant, who creates the world, but remains in close and dynamic contact with the world. And so he goes on, and this is again from the lecture that many of you chose to listen to, and the whole lecture is on the idea of what does it mean that Jesus was God, which is of course very relevant to our topic this week as well. And so I'll read just a passage from that lecture. He says, this God was both other than the world and continually active within it. The words transcendent and immanent, we should note, are pointers to this double belief, but do not clarify it much. Because this God is thus simultaneously other than his people and present with them, Jews of Jesus' day had developed several ways of speaking about the activity of this God, in which they attempted to hold together because they dared not separate these twin truths. Emboldened by deep-rooted traditions, they explored what appears to us a strange, swirling sense of a rhythm of mutual relations within the very being of the one God. A to and fro, a give and take, a command and obey, a sense of love poured out and love received. So then he goes to talk about these central elements in the Tanakh of who God is and what God's presence looks like amongst his people. So God's Spirit broods over the waters. God's word goes forth to produce new life. God's law guides his people. God's presence or glory dwells with them in fiery cloud and tabernacle and temple. God's wisdom is his handmaid in creation, the firstborn of his works, his chief of staff, his delight. So N.T. Wright says, these 5 ways of speaking move to and fro from metaphor to trembling reality claim and back again. They enable Jews to speak simultaneously of God's sovereign supremacy in his intimate presence, of his unapproachable holiness, and his self-giving, compassionate love. So these 5 elements which N.T. Wright elaborates on in that lecture, which is also available in written form, Spirit, Word, Wisdom, Temple, and Torah, give N.T. Wright the framework for how he then is going to reflect on Yeshua as the embodiment of Spirit, Word, Wisdom, Temple, and Torah. And so I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, again, we've talked before about N.T. Wright and how his thought has both a lot to offer and yet areas of inadequacy, areas of sneaking supersessionism, areas where we would want to push back. And again, Mark Kinzer is working on a book project where he spends most of that space interacting with the thought of N.T. Wright, both praising its strengths and pushing back against its weaknesses. And so it'd be interesting. It's not one of our forum questions this week, but I would, of course, be interested to hear your own feedback to this approach, to N.T. Wright's approach of enumerating these ways in which God is present throughout Tanakh, and how Yeshua embodies those realities of God's presence. So on the next slide are just a few scripture verses from the New Testament explaining how Yeshua is embodying these concrete realities of God. So let's move on and talk a bit about Yeshua and/as Israel. According to Kinzer, he says, from a Messianic Jewish perspective, every theological topic must be considered in connection with Israel and in connection with Yeshua, and Israel and Yeshua must always be considered in relation to one another, which I think, we've talked about what are sort of necessary what makes Messianic Jewish theology, and I would say this is one of them, keeping Israel and Messiah central in our thought, and always thinking about them in conjunction, in sort of a self-informing way, connected to one another. We really can't understand the people or the vocation of Israel without looking to the life of Yeshua, and we certainly can't understand the life, death, or resurrection of Yeshua without seeing his connection to and his embodiment of the people of Israel. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Just a few scriptures from the Tanakh about God's purpose for Israel. So Genesis 12:3, the call of Abraham. Already back then is the promise that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, through Abraham. We see in Isaiah repeated imagery all throughout the prophets, in fact, of this expansion of God's presence and the knowledge of God in the world. We looked at this a couple weeks ago, this idea of the outward expansion of Israel's holiness, which is, of course, in tension with Israel's guarded holiness, which Israel has to kind of preserve in certain ways. Zechariah 14 is a great description of what this outwardly expanding holiness will be like. The idea that the bells on the horses will be as holy as the instruments in the temple, this kind of democratization of God's holiness, which, if you remember from a few weeks ago and the studies that you all have done, there is a distinct realm and specificity of God's holiness in the Tanakh, and the vision throughout the prophets is that holiness will expand. And so we talked about the way in which Yeshua comes into contact with all three of Jacob Milgram's sources of ritual impurity. Remember, things that would contaminate Israel's holiness or purity. We looked specifically at Matthew 8 and 9. In 2 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, Messiah comes into contact with all of those. So in him, we see the actual concrete expansion of God's holiness. And of course, with that comes breaking down this barrier between Jews and Gentiles, the barrier of hostility that has always existed between Israel and the nations. That is part and parcel of the outward expansion of knowledge and holiness of God. We, of course, also have to talk about the suffering of Messiah. Page 261 and following, if you're interested in that. But one of the ways that we can get at this is the dual interpretation of passages like Isaiah 53, these suffering servants passages, which classically throughout Jewish theology have often been interpreted as referring to Israel itself. So Israel is the one who's the suffering servant, who is despised and rejected, who carries the sorrows of the people, who is stricken by God. And there's this idea that we'll get to in just a second, that somehow Israel's suffering is atoning, which is a fascinating theological thought, especially in the post-Holocaust era. We get a number of Jewish thinkers reflecting on the possibility that Israel is in fact suffering in some sense redemptively on behalf of the other nations, which is fascinating and leads us into interesting theologically and intellectually when we talk about Messiah as the embodiment of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and other passages, right? We see this close aligning of Messiah's suffering and the suffering of Israel. So Michael Visegrad wonders, is it not possible that the rabbis understood that the destruction of the temple and the cessation of sacrifices, rather than signaling the termination of sacrifices as such, restored the people of Israel to its role as the sacrifice whose blood is to be shed in the diaspora when the holy service in Jerusalem is suspended? If there's no need for sacrament in Judaism, it is because the people of Israel, in whose flesh the presence of God makes itself felt in the world, becomes the sacrament. So really interesting, and again, there's a whole section in my dissertation which talks about theology of suffering and the way in which these ideas become connected, particularly in a post-Holocaust environment. But of course, Michael Visegrad is the perfect candidate to sort of connect these ideas for us. And he doesn't believe in the redemptive suffering of Yeshua as Messiah, but the way in which he talks about Israel's redemptive and sort of atoning suffering leads right into this idea of Messiah as the one-man Israel who, like Israel at large, suffers on behalf of humanity, whose suffering atones for and is redemptive toward the brokenness of humanity. And so, again, Kinsley's done a lot of writing on Yeshua as the one artwork. Who's sort of the quintessential Jewish painter of the 20th century, began painting and sketching depictions of the crucifixion as he attempted to grapple with the horrors of the Holocaust. Throughout his life, he produced over 100 crucifixion images where he portrays Yeshua as a quintessentially Jewish figure. In the painting that you have here, which is called the White Crucifixion, Yeshua is wearing a talit. He's wearing a Jewish prayer shawl. And there's all kinds of Jewish imagery that Chagall uses to kind of Judaize Messiah. And here he's surrounded by these kind of disturbing, horrific images of destruction of synagogues and stranded Jews. In the bottom right-hand corner, you have the prototypical wandering Jew who has nowhere to flee and no place to call home. There's sort of flames and all of this image of chaos and destruction with Yeshua at the center of it. And so Chagall explains that Yeshua becomes for him the true type of the Jewish martyr, that Yeshua is kind of the only fitting symbol for the ongoing horror and terror of Jewish suffering, which is a fascinating kind of reclaiming of Yeshua as an emblem of Jewish suffering that we see, again, especially in the post-Holocaust era. And there's a really interesting book that is written about this by Matthew Hoffman called From Rebel to Rabbi, Reclaiming Jesus and the Making of Modern Jewish Culture, where he reflects upon the way in which Jewish thinkers, theologians, artists, poets have repeatedly reached for the image of Yeshua as they've tried to explain and put words and images to the horrors of the Holocaust. So the sort of innocent suffering of Yeshua as a Jewish martyr is such a powerful image that has carried its way through the centuries that Jews who have no faith in Yeshua and perhaps no respect for Yeshua in the way that believers in Yeshua do, are claiming his suffering as an emblem of Jewish suffering. Perhaps even more telling than the White Crucifixion is Chagall's painting called Exodus, which you see on the next slide, where The scene here is Moses receiving the two tablets, the Ten Commandments. Moses appears in the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. The people of Israel there, you can see that the sort of pillar of fire off to the left. There's sacrificial imagery up to the right, the goat and the rooster, and then you see looming over the whole scene a crucifixion. And so the idea being that Israel already was kind of facing this suffering vocation even at its inception at Sinai. And of course, Chagall again reaching for the image of Messiah's suffering to represent the suffering that would repeatedly befall the people of Israel. So all kinds of interesting ways that we can sort of get at the connection between Messiah and Israel, and the suffering of both, and the connection between Israel's suffering and Messiah's suffering being one of those important connection points. Let's move on to talk about Yeshua and slash as Torah. So the first thing is a reminder of this quote from John Levinson, where he wants to talk about the idea of the Torah as the ketubah, as the sort of marriage contract between God and Israel. So to read this quote again, he says, covenant love is mutual. It distinguishes a relationship of reciprocity. On God's side lies an obligation to fulfill the oath he swore to the patriarchs, to grant their descendants the promised land, to be their God. Israel, for her part, is to realize her love in the form of observance of her master's stipulations, the mitzvot, for they are the words of the language of love, the fit medium in which to respond to the passionate advances of the divine suzerain. It is not a question of law or love, but law conceived in love, love expressed in law. The two are a unity. To speak of one apart from the other is to produce a parity of the religion of Israel. The love of God moves Israel to embrace the norms of Sinai. And so here, of course, is Torah as a pattern of life for the people of Israel, and this sort of double love command as the heart of Torah, and of course, Yeshua's greatest commandment. And this is one of the places where I think it's fascinating to reflect on Yeshua, again, as fully God and fully man. Yeshua is God's presence in the world, but he's also the perfect response to God from humanity's part. Right, so Yeshua is both there at the beginning. He's the agency of creation, but he also fully embodies what obedience to God through a life of Torah looks like. And there's probably no greater Christian theologian who encapsulates the idea of God, of Yeshua as fully God and fully man than Karl Barth. Karl Barth really plays up the way in which Yeshua represents God to humanity and represents humanity to God. So there's a lot we could say about Barth. Again, there's a whole chapter in my dissertation talking about Barth's doctrine of Israel. But I just want to read us this quote that Barth, where he's describing election. And what's really interesting in Barth's theology is that when he talks about election, he first and foremost is talking about the election of Yeshua. Yeshua as the agent of Israel's election and the election of the body of Messiah, but first and foremost, God elects Yeshua, and that is the center of history for Barth. So just to read this short quote, Barth writes, in the beginning, before time and space as we know them, before creation, before there was any reality distinct from God, which could be the object of the love of God or the setting for his acts in freedom, God anticipated and determined within himself that the goal and meaning of all his dealings with the as yet non-existent universe should be the fact that in his Son he would be gracious toward man, uniting himself with him. And so again, this divine human unity that we see in Messiah, I think Barth does a beautiful job describing how that is the goal and the center of creation. The goal and the center of all of human history is this oneness of divinity and humanity that we see in the person of Yeshua. And so for Barth, he reminds us that when we talk about God, we are necessarily talking about the God who covenants with human beings, and therefore we're also talking about humanity as well. Um, and so that link between God being present to humanity through Messiah, but also humanity being obedient to God through Messiah, through Yeshua's perfect embodiment of Torah. And so we talked about this, I think we brought this up in the very end of last week's forum discussion. What does a messianic view on Torah add to a Jewish view? The idea that Torah observance is not just obedience from a classically Jewish perspective, but for us, Torah observance is also imitation of Messiah. And I think that's a really important point, because all too often we separate these two things, and we saw that in the readings from last week. Of course, it's easy to find very rich Jewish reflections on Torah obedience, and scholars like Dallas Willard give us a great portrait, I think, of what it means to truly follow Messiah, this sort of life of discipleship, this life of spiritual discipline, but those, because of the chasm between Jewish theology and Christian theology, are rarely brought together. And I think we have the unique ability to show how following Messiah, imitating Messiah, is a life of Torah observance. So that's the connection that I want us to see. And of course, in recent decades, again, especially post-Holocaust, not only do we see a reclaiming of the Jewish Messiah in the things like the works of Marc Chagall, but we see an intellectual and a scholarly Jewish reclamation of Messiah. So much of this begins with Geza Vermesh's book, Jesus the Jew, in the 1970s, and now we have this whole body of literature by Jewish New Testament scholars like Amy Jo Levine, Mark Nanos, Paula Fredrickson, Pamela Eisenbaum, all of whom comprise what's often called the radical new perspective on Paul, but are also doing plenty of scholarship on Yeshua, where Yeshua is being put back in his Jewish context, and the argument is being made that Yeshua and Paul and the entire early body of believers was, of course, Torah observant, which is kind of shocking to many New Testament scholars who haven't traditionally thought of Messiah in that way. I think it's a huge asset, as we've talked about before, to our movement, that this is the current trend in New Testament scholarship. But again, it helps us to see the intimate connection between Messiah and Torah, the way in which Messiah embodies Torah and thereby gives us a model of how to live in full obedience to God. And so I think about someone like Daniel Boyarin, his reading of John 1:1, where he wants to talk about the way in which this type of discussion of Yeshua fits well within a first-century Jewish framework. So that tension that we see, whereby following Yeshua never quite connects to living a life of Torah, is being broken down by this new phase in New Testament scholarship. So if we look at passages, again, Matthew 5, the whole Sermon on the Mount, is a great example of Yeshua's authority. And one of the things that's happening in recent New Testament scholarship, for a long, long time, these statements in Matthew 5, you have heard it said so-and-so, but I say to you, have been read as opposition statements, as Yeshua superseding the Torah, giving a new authority, and that played right into replacement theology, right? Yeshua's writing a new Torah. It's kind of out with the old, in with the new. Whereas more modern scholarship and commentary on these types of passages is saying this is a very common rabbinic phraseology, rabbinic rhetoric, whereby the but is not, it's not actually but, it's more of like yet or and so what's going on here is not antithesis, but rather interpretation, which again was very common in rabbinical discourse. And so this is just one tiny example of the way in which this new vein of Jewish New Testament scholarship is helping us to see the connection between Yeshua and Torah in a new way. And I think it's very exciting. I mean, I think that we live in remarkable times, and I can't wait to see where things are at in another 15 or 20 years, when this kind of scholarship and thinking has really had more of a chance to play out, and when there's more scholarship being done from a Messianic Jewish perspective that's making even more of a direct connection between between Judaism and Messiah, between Judaism and Yeshua. I think, again, we live in remarkable and exciting times with regard to these concepts. So that's, again, barely scratching the surface of Yeshua, a Messianic Jewish perspective on Yeshua. Again, thinking all of Messianic Jewish thought through the lens of Yeshua. And again, we'll do this in the coming weeks with regard to the doctrine of the Spirit and the land. Let me talk briefly about this week's readings, and then I'll introduce our forum questions for this week. We are reading from Solon again this week, and that's the reading that I actually want us to focus on in the rest of our discussion. We're finishing the Solon book, so we're reading the second half, which is his creative proposal. If you remember, in chapters 1 through 4, he diagnoses the problem of Christian supersessionism throughout the centuries. Now he wants to give his solution, and so we'll talk about that in just a minute. We're also continuing on in our Visegrad book and in the Kinzer book. So I'm not going to talk about all of the readings this week. As I said, I want to just focus on Solon this week, who will also set us up for this week's forum questions. Solon in the second half of the God of Israel and Christian Theology gives his one-sentence gospel, which we've already talked about. We wrote our own one-sentence gospels, and I encourage you to go back and look at your one-sentence gospel just as we continue to unpack these ideas. But let's look at Solon's for just a second in light of the both diagnosis of Christian supersessionism that he's giving and the creative proposal of how he thinks that it can be overcome in this canonical narrative. This is how he would summarize the gospel. He says, the gospel is good news about the God of Israel's coming reign, which proclaims in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection the victorious guarantee of God's fidelity to the work of consummation, that is, to fullness of mutual blessing as the outcome of God's economy with Israel, the nations, and all creation. So again, Solon's emphasis on consummation, that's a big part of his creative task, is not just looking at Messiah as Redeemer, but Messiah as the culmination of consummation. Again, this idea of mutual blessing between Israel and the nations, reconciliation between Jew and Gentile, which is finally accomplished in Messiah, and of course, again, is the heart of the tension and the conflict that we see throughout the Tanakh. And so Messiah as the guarantee of God's fidelity to the work of consummation. Again, I welcome you, it's not one of our forum questions, but I welcome you to interact with Solon's one-sentence gospel in our forum conversation this week. There's a lot, I think, that can be praised about what he's doing, but of course a lot that can be critiqued as well. One critique comes from John Polakowski, who's a very prominent voice in Jewish-Christian relations, who wants to critique Solon for ultimately leaving us with a low Christology. Yeshua as ultimate creational fulfillment, but not as God incarnate. That doesn't come through in Solon's one-sentence gospel. So here's Polakowski both praising Solon for what he does accomplish, for overcoming supersessionism, but not for putting forth the kind of Christology that really passes muster for Orthodox Christian or even Messianic Jewish confession. And in fact, it's a weakness that Solon himself is aware of. In our Rudolph and Willits book, Solon has an essay where he admits this weakness in his own thought. So he writes, page 285, I am no longer satisfied with some of the things I wrote in the God of Israel and Christian Theology. He says, basically, I failed to give Christology and the doctrine of the Trinity a central and constitutive place in my canonical narrative. However, unintentionally, I treated these affirmations as necessary but secondary truths to be fitted into the pre-existing framework of God's consummating work as the God of Israel. Even at the time, I had misgivings about this approach. Still, I could not imagine how else to formulate a canonical narrative without supersessionism. And so I think Solon's, his book is the book that we're reading is kind of the classic treatment of Christian supersessionism. He's a brilliant scholar and a wonderful person, and I think it's easy to sort of critique what he's done wrong, but his efforts demonstrate how difficult it is to reconcile these concepts. So in the description that we just read, he admits to putting the doctrine of Messiah and the doctrine of Trinity kind of second to the consummating work of the God of Israel, which I think is a challenge to us of how do we fit these things together. Remember, I talked very early on in the course about what I like about systematic theology is that we take all these individual doctrines and then we try to create a coherent theological framework by putting the various pieces together. So how can we put the pieces together in a way that both avoids and overcomes supersessionism, but also holds up Messiah to the full stature that he must be held to, and equality, oneness with God is part and parcel of that. So Solon talks about how he thought he would come out with his second book in just a couple years, and instead it took him over a decade of wrestling with these concepts before he felt ready to kind of come back again and reconceive them. And so his second book is the first in a two-part series on precisely the Trinity. He's trying to come back and redo what he saw as ultimately inadequate in his first book. And so the primary goal of his second book is to restore the divine name to its proper place in the infinite economy of Trinitarian names. If you haven't picked this book up yet, I really recommend it. It's a fascinating look at the divine name and the Trinity, and he kind of does this treatment of the Tetragrammaton throughout the New Testament and throughout even early church history, where he's kind of claiming there's this constant thread of continuity that we miss because we don't realize, especially coming from a traditionally Christian perspective, the way in which this kind of circumlocution continued to be used in the early church. So not referring to God's name, instead using these kind of roundabout references, the way that we say Hashem to refer to God, and he kind of traces the way in which he thinks that was influential in the New Testament writings, and again, even into the early church documents. So again, this is his second book. The second part of this book on the divine names and the Trinity, I think is coming out soon. I'm not exactly sure when, but it's Solon trying to recast his Christology and his doctrine of the Trinity in a way that he feels was inadequate in his first book. So finally, that leads us to our discussion questions for this week that are building largely on our Solon readings from the week. So just kind of taking a step back and looking broadly at the topic of supersessionism, which of course we've already touched on a bit in our forum discussions. It's hard not to touch on when we're talking about what needs to be done in terms of rethinking Christian theology. So from your perspective, what areas of Christian theology are most impoverished by the enduring legacy of supersessionism? In what ways has supersessionism particularly affected and impoverished our understanding of Yeshua? And second, what is your assessment of Solon's attempt to place God's role as Redeemer within God's overarching role as consummator, which is one of his proposals, central proposals for how we can undo a supersessionist framework? And then how does Yeshua fit into this? So what does it do to our understanding of Yeshua to sort of shift the emphasis not only to the doctrine of redemption, but to the idea of consummation, Yeshua bringing about final consummation to God's purpose and plan. So those are the specific discussion questions for this week. Again, I also encourage you to offer reflections on N.T. Wright's paradigm, the looking at Yeshua through the lens of wisdom, word, spirit, temple, and Torah, which are the elements that he unpacks as God's presence to his people Israel. And I also encourage you to reflect on Solon's one-sentence gospel, perhaps in light of or in comparison to your own one-sentence gospel. So again, that is our barely scratching the surface of a doctrinal understanding of Yeshua. I very much look forward to your comments this week and our discussion together.